So now let me tell you about render settings in Element 3D. This tab is almost at the bottom. Let's go through each of the parameters. Physical environment. First, there's environment exposure, then gamma, allowing you to control the light. Next is override layer. We can upload our texture here. For example, I have a screenshot of my Instagram account. And in override layer, I can select this layer. And now we have an environment map we just selected. We can also adjust it and rotate it along all axes. And that's all with physical environment. The Lighting tab. By default, Element 3D creates a default light which you can see right here on the object. You won't find it in Timeline, but it's here in Element 3D. You can also configure it in additional lighting below. You can change its position. If we disable it, we won't see it. If we, however, create some kind of light, that's just a new light. Okay. We won't see Element 3D's light. It will merge with one we've just created. If we turn it off, again, let's continue. And if you turn it off here, in general, this checkbox allows you to use the light you have in the composition. There is a lot of default lighting presets here. For example, Dramatic creates 3 different lights, and Stylized creates blue at the top and orange at the bottom. So there's still a bunch of presets which work very well and look pretty good. The Shadow tab activates shadow. There is nothing difficult here, but it works only when you have a light source. I have such a simple scene with a light source shining from right to left or from left to right. And in light settings, be sure to check the Cast Shadows box and increase shadow darkness to 100%. As you can see, everything works. You can also select map size, like the quality of the shadow rendering. You can set the value to 256 or turn it off while working on the project and then to 4096 before rendering. The number of shadow samples impacts the quality as well. The more samples, the better the quality. You can blur it all. And there are a few settings for each of the lighting modes. Spotlight, Parallel light. Now it is spot parallel light. By increasing shadow size, we are scaling up the shadow rendering. And that's all about shadow. Next, let's talk about subsurface scattering, SSS. There is such a scene here. Let's switch to the settings. We can enable and disable it. And let's talk a little bit about subsurface scattering, about how it works. I skipped the topic when we talked about textures, and I'm going to tell you about it now. Surprise! To see how the SSS works, you need to select the SSS light here in the light settings. The last one here. Besides, in the material settings, the Edit tab, check the subsurface scattering box in the corresponding section. And here, you can already adjust the color. Yes, let it be white. Intensity. Then scattering. The latter determines how light rays will pass through the object. And then, there are some more settings that I do not use. Also, here you can configure everything. The number of samples. If it's small, the picture will have lots of digital noise, so you can always raise it to 75. As a result, you'll get a high-quality rendering. Also, intensity. By the way, I do not recommend setting the samples parameter too high. Literally, this much, I think, is enough. This digital noise is not crucial. If you have a weak computer, it's better to set the value below 30. Even my powerful PC sometimes lags and freezes. Well, here are the same settings as in the material settings, but here you can configure everything for the whole scene. Let's move on. We have ambient occlusion here. Enabling it, you'll enable shadows at the junction of objects. Let's increase intensity. Now it's 0, and now shadings like this appear. I enable this parameter quite often to dimensionalize the scene. Even now, without any effect and only with the environment map, as well as subsurface scattering applied, everything looks good. There are settings and samples here as well. I always work with 64 samples, since 8 is too few, while 256 and 128 are too much. You can see slow here in parentheses. It means that everything will work much more slowly. So 64 is what we need. Here you can also select the color of shadows if you want. But I'll keep it black. What do we have next? Next is the Made Shadow tab. Made Shadow is quite a simple thing. For example, I have a model, and for one of the objects for this cube, I'll enable Made Shadow. We have the object, but it only displays shadows. Click OK. Now I have ambient occlusion enabled here, so you can see these shadows. And if you need to turn them off for the whole scene, you just go to Made Shadow and do it. And everything is already disabled. You can configure it all here as well. Reflection. Reflection is similar to Made Shadow, only it is Made Reflection. If you have a scene and one of the objects in the scene has Made Shadow enabled, like in this scene, here I have an ordinary floor with an ordinary texture. In Glossiness, I simply uploaded a screenshot from one of my videos and got such a nice texture with splatters and scuffs. So I enabled Made Reflection here, so that only reflections are displayed. And here, you can turn them off for the whole scene and improve the quality of reflections as well. Next is Fog. We can set it to 100, for example, and reduce fog distance. With the fog range parameter, you can gradually wrap your object in fog from behind if you reduce it. And the objects behind the set value simply won't be visible, completely fading away if your opacity is 100. You can also use this parameter to dimensionalize the scene as well. What's next? Next we have Motion Blur. I don't know what to say about it actually. Just check the Motion Blur box and, in theory, it should work. Enable it here as well and you'll have such a motion blur. You can set it to turn on and off only when it is enabled in the composition settings. We can disable it and change the mode motion blur to on. As a result, it always be enabled regardless of whether it is enabled in our compositions or not. You can also increase the number of samples. It determines how many times this blur will be duplicated. If you set this parameter to 2, it will be duplicated only twice. There are the original object and 2 more behind it. Therefore, I also recommend raising this parameter when you're rendering. Shutter angle determines how blurry everything will be. Next is depth of field. Depth of field is one of the usual camera settings. That's it. Let's disable motion blur. Then, enable depth of field in camera 1 and increase aperture. Now we'll set the correct focus with focus distance and we'll eventually see the blur on the object. Element 3D works with the depth of field, that is the camera setting, quite fine. And here you can also configure everything or turn it off for some layers. If you have several layers with Element 3D and don't want to apply blur to one of them, just turn it off here. There are also the blur modes. I never change them from pixel blur. You can select Preview Blur just to load preview faster. That's all. Glow. I never use it, so I don't even want to talk about it. I only apply glow on top of objects. You can play with it if you have some illumination enabled for one of the layers. Ray Tracer. I never use it either. Here you can select the display modes, but I never do. Camera Cut All is a parameter that controls on what distance all objects disappear. Now I have it at 50,000. If you reduce its value and turn off depth of field, you can notice how everything is just cut by some kind of plane. You can also make it move from the front to back. This parameter allows you to create some spectacular animations, such an entrance, for example. And that's all about render settings. Here is the Output tab here. I also rarely use it. Here you can simply select various display modes for your object. This is a depth map, the Z-depth mode. Let's set the camera near plane parameter to 1. Here you can find such modes as normals, ambient occlusion, reflection, etc. The SSS as well, but we don't have it now, so it's invisible. And you can also use these parameters and duplicate the layer with Element 3D. Select reflection here and adjust opacity. You can configure everything the way you want. And the lesson about the Element 3D settings is over. See you in the next ones.